Hello, everyone. I'm the Sleep Storyteller, and I am here to help you. Today, I know you're using this video to fall asleep. So, take a deep breath and let the worries of the day fade away. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. It truly helps. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now get cozy. Close your eyes and let's begin your journey to deep relaxation beneath the vast emerald canopy of the woodland realm, where ancient trees stretched their limbs toward the heavens and silver streams whispered their eternal songs to the moss-covered earth. The last Elven king stood in solemn stillness. Thranduil, son of Orifer, ruler of the fatting greenwood, felt the weight of centuries pressing upon him like the hush before a storm. His kingdom, once brimming with laughter and song, now stood in quiet reverence, a place of memories and echoes. The elves who attended these woods, who had woven their stories into the very fabric of the land, were leaving, one by one, answering the call of the sea. The undying lands beckoned beyond the reach of shadow and sorrow, and those who had long endured the trials of Middle-earth now sought their final refuge. Yet Thranduil remained, bound to this place like the last leaf clinging to a branch in the wake of autumn. From the high balcony of his grand hall, he gazed out over the endless forest, its deep shadows and golden light mingling in the hush of twilight. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, mingled with the quiet rustling of falling leaves. The world beyond these trees was changing. The age of men had begun, and the time of the elves was fading like candlelight in the wind. And yet, the forest still called to him. It had been his home since youth, when he walked these lands beside his father, Orifer, a proud and noble king, who had led their kin into battle against the Dark Lord in the War of the Last Alliance. The memories surged unbidden, the thunder of marching orcs, the clash of steel, the cries of the fallen. He had stood upon the bloodied fields of Dagorlad, young but hardened by war, and watched his father fall beneath Sauron's banners, with the blood of his kin soaking the earth. He had sworn an oath that their people would endure, that their home would not be lost to the encroaching darkness. A gentle wind stirred the branches, and Thranduil closed his eyes, listening. The rustling leaves, the murmuring river, the faint echoes of voices long gone. He heard the laughter of Legolas as a child, the songs of his people woven into garlands of golden flowers, the solemn prayers spoken in the deep shadows of ancient trees. All of it was fading. The silence stretched deeper than it had ever been before. But then, a soft step behind him broke the stillness. "Your Grace," came a quiet voice. He turned to see Galleon, his most trusted attendant, standing at the threshold of the balcony. Sorrow was etched into his features. "A message has arrived from Lothlorien." Thranduil's fingers tightened around the carved railing, his gaze still fixed upon the trees. Even the golden wood was emptying. Lady Galadriel had departed, and Celeborn lingered still, but his heart had already turned westward. Soon, Lothlorien would stand silent, its its song lost to the world of men. With the faintest nod, he signaled Galleon to continue. "There are whispers," Galleon hesitated, his voice cautious, "of movement in the south, the ruins of Dal Guldur." The name alone sent a shadow through Thranduil's mind. Dal Guldur, the ancient fortress where the necromancer had once dwelled, where darkness had clung like poison to the roots of the world. The fortress had been cast down, its evil purged, yet he knew all too well that darkness never truly died. It merely waited. His voice was steady, though cold. "Who carries this warning?" "A scout from Lothlorien," Galleon answered. "He rode with haste and begs an audience." Thranduil turned his gaze back to the forest, his mind a storm of thought. This land was still his charge, even if his kin had abandoned it, even if the world moved on without him. He would not allow darkness to rise again, not while he still had breath. "Bring him to me." Galleon bowed and departed, leaving the Elven king alone in the quiet hush of dusk. For a long moment, Thranduil stood unmoving, his thoughts drifting through the ages. He had ruled through war and peace, through the rising and falling of shadows. He had seen the world shift before, but never had he felt its weight so keenly as he did now. As the first stars shimmered in the twilight sky, he breathed in the cool night air and whispered to the trees, to the spirits of his people who had gone before him, "I will not forsake this land." Far beyond the trees, where the ruins of Dal Guldur lay shrouded in mist, something stirred in the darkness. The hall of Thranduil was vast, carved deep into the very roots of the forest, its walls gleaming under the soft glow of enchanted lanterns. Their golden light flickered like the last warmth of autumn, illuminating the grandeur that time could not diminish. The scent of damp earth, thick with the memory of rain, mingled with the crisp fragrance of pine and oak. It was a place of ancient majesty, hewn from the bones of the land itself, a sanctuary where the echoes of ages past whispered through the air. And yet, time had begun to press upon it, creeping in like ivy along the stone, seeking to reclaim what had long stood beyond its reach. Thranduil moved through the great hall with measured steps, his long robes brushing against the polished floor, his silver circlet catching the flickering torchlight. He was a figure of cold grace, untouched by the years in the way of the Eldar, yet his eyes bore the weight of centuries. His people called him timeless, but even the timeless could feel the slow erosion of all they had built. As he ascended the high steps to his throne, the silence of the hall seemed deeper than it had in centuries past. Once, these chambers had been filled with song, harps, and flutes, voices raised in celebration of the stars, the endless beauty of life. Now, silence reigned, broken only by the distant trickle of water running through the mountain's veins, like the slow heartbeat of a slumbering giant. The heavy doors groaned open, and into the great hall stepped the scout from Lothlorien. His cloak was damp with the night's dew, his boots stained with the dust of long roads. Weariness lined his sharp features, but his keen eyes did not waver as he knelt before the Elven king, pressing a hand to his chest in reverence. Though he bowed, his gaze met Thranduil's without hesitation. "You bring word from the Golden Wood," Thranduil said, his voice low and steady, like a river moving beneath ice. "Tell me, does Celeborn still walk beneath the Malorn, or has he too forsaken these shores?" The scout rose, shadows crossing his expression. "The Lord of Lorien lingers still, but not for long. The havens call to him, and the golden trees whisper of his coming departure. Soon the wood shall stand empty, and the memory of the Galadrim shall fade like mist upon the river." He hesitated, glancing toward the high arches overhead, as though afraid the very walls might hear his next words. "But the forest does not rest easy, my lord. There are things that stir in the ruins of Dol Guldur, things that should not be." The name hung in the air like a shadow unspoken. Thranduil's fingers tightened upon the arm of his throne, his nails pressing into the smooth, time-worn wood. Dol Guldur once, it had been the stronghold of the necromancer, a festering wound upon the land from which darkness had seeped into the very roots of greenwood. He had seen its rise, had watched the creeping shadow twist the trees, poison the streams, silence the once vibrant forest. He had seen its fall too, when the White Council had broken its walls and driven the dark power forth. But evil had a way of lingering, of sinking deep into the marrow of the world, waiting. "Speak plainly," he commanded, his voice quieter now, colder. "What have you seen?" The scout hesitated, then stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "It is no longer the fortress it once was," he said, his voice laced with a strange reluctance, as if to utter the words was to give them power. "The towers have crumbled, the halls are shattered, and the stronghold where darkness once dwelt lies in ruin. And yet, the land itself is restless. The trees do not grow as they should. The earth trembles in the night, as if something beneath it stirs. And the wind," his voice faltered for a brief moment, "the wind carries whispers, my lord. Whispers that do not belong to the living. A silence stretched between them, thick and heavy as the mist over the southern woods." The torches flickered, their light casting shadows that wavered upon the stone, shifting like figures at the edge of sight. Thranduil had spent an age fighting the creeping dark, had seen what it could do to land and mind alike. He had known the weight of grief when his father fell, had tasted the bitterness of war and the slow erosion of all that was fair in the world. And now, at the very end of the age, when all should be quiet, when all should be fadding into the west with the ships that bore his kindred beyond the reach of sorrow. Now, the darkness threatened once more to rise from the bones of the earth. "The dominion of men has begun," he murmured at last, more to himself than to the elf before him. "The Eldar depart, and Middle-earth is left to its fate. That is the way of things." His gaze lifted to the vast expanse of his hall, to the carved trees upon the pillars, their golden leaves forever caught in the frozen embrace of stone. "But this land still stands. This forest still breathes, and I will not see it fall to shadow again." The scout inclined his head. "Then you will act." Thranduil's gaze darkened. He had watched over this realm for longer than most could remember. He had seen the rise and fall of kings, had stood upon battlefields drenched in blood, had felt the weight of grief settle upon him like the first frost of winter. And yet he remained. When all others left, he remained. "I will act," he said at last, and there was steel in his voice, a quiet promise that echoed through the chamber like the toll of a distant bell. But not rashly. If Dol Guldur stirs once more, then we must know what darkness lingers there. We must tread carefully, lest we awaken something best left undisturbed. The scout bowed. "Then I shall return, my lord, and see that our eyes remain upon the ruins." Thranduil's gaze lingered upon the farthest shadows of the hall, where the firelight did not reach. "Do so," he said, his voice a quiet command. "And tell me everything you see." The elf turned, his footsteps light upon the stone, and soon the great doors closed behind him, leaving the hall once more in silence. Thranduil remained unmoving, his thoughts drifting like leaves upon a river. The world had changed, and he had endured it all. But for how much longer? He had lived through the fall of kingdoms, had stood at the edge of ruin, and refused to be swept away. He had built walls around his heart as surely as he had built them around his realm. But even the strongest walls could not hold forever, and deep in the south, beneath the crumbling stones of Dol Guldur, something watched. The hall stood silent long after the scout had departed, its ancient pillars casting long shadows against the polished stone where torchlight flickered, as if caught between wakefulness and slumber. Thranduil remained motionless upon his throne, his thoughts spiraling through the depths of time, drifting through the labyrinth of memory where sorrow and duty intertwined like the roots of an old tree. The weight of ages pressed upon his shoulders, not in the form of years. Elves did not bear time as men did, but in the gradual erosion of all that was familiar. He had watched the world shift, had seen the slow unraveling of the Eldar's dominion, the diminishing of their splendor like the setting sun sinking into an endless horizon. And now, at the very edge of twilight, he found himself a lone sentinel in a world that was no longer his. Outside, the forest murmured with the restless sigh of wind weaving through ancient boughs, stirring the crisp scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. The trees whispered, though fewer now remained to hear their voices. Once, the elves of Greenwood had walked beneath these boughs, their hands tracing the rough bark, their songs woven into the rustling leaves, binding them to the land as closely as roots to the soil. But now, so many had gone. The paths they had once tread lay undisturbed. Their laughter had faded into silence, and the golden lanterns that had once glowed beneath the canopy of stars now flickered in half-empty halls. It was not grief that tightened around Thranduil's heart, for he had made peace with loss long ago. No, it was something colder, something deeper, a sense of quiet inevitability, like the final leaf that falls from a tree long after autumn has passed, surrendering at last to winter's embrace. Footsteps echoed through the chamber, slow and deliberate, breaking the stillness as Galleon approached. His face was set in solemn contemplation, had served Thranduil for centuries, and though the years left no mark upon his fair features, his eyes had grown heavy with the weight of the world's slow decay. He halted a few steps before the throne, bowing his head slightly before speaking. "My lord, you have heard the tidings from Lothlorien. What is to be done?" Thranduil exhaled softly, his gaze drifting toward the carved roots upon the pillars, their twisting shapes mirroring the endless dance of fate, always growing, always reaching, yet bound by the weight of the past. "The world moves on, Galleon. The tide recedes, and the Eldar with it." His voice was quiet, but within it lay the echo of something old and unyielding, something not yet ready to bend to the wind of change. There was a time when we stood as lords of these lands, when our people flourished beneath the stars, untouched by the shadow of men or the greed of dwarves. But that time has passed, and I, it seems, am left to watch the end. Galleon's brow furrowed, and for a moment he hesitated, as if weighing whether his words were fit to speak. But at last he lifted his gaze. "And yet, my lord, you do not leave. The ships wait, the havens call, and still you remain. You speak of endings, yet you linger in this place as though it were not the world that is fatting, but yourself." A flicker of something unreadable passed through Thranduil's eyes, and for a moment the weight of ages settled upon him, casting a shadow deeper than the darkness beyond the borders of his realm. "Because I remember," he said at last, his voice softer now, tinged with something almost weary. "I remember the first time I set foot upon these lands, when greenwood stretched from the misty mountains to the river's edge, when my father stood beside me and swore that here we would endure. I remember the first great war, when we marched to Dagorlad, young and proud, believing that our strength was enough to challenge the tide of shadow. I remember the bodies upon the battlefield, the blood upon my hands, my father falling beneath the banners of Mordor, while the sky burned above us. And I remember returning home to a kingdom that no longer felt whole, to a people who looked to me to lead them through the long years of darkness." His gaze sharpened, cold as winter's first frost. "And I did. Through war, through loss, through the slow creeping of shadow into our borders, I remained. And if I have remained through all these things, why should I leave now?" Galleon bowed his head slightly, as though in reverence. But when he spoke again, his voice carried a quiet resolve. "Because the world has changed, my lord, and even the strongest trees must bow before the storm, lest they be broken by it." Thranduil was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed upon the distant torches that lined the farthest reaches of the hall, their golden light flickering like distant stars upon a darkened sea. When at last he spoke, his words carried the weight of something unspoken, something only he could truly understand. "Then let it break me if it must, but I will not leave." Galleon studied him for a moment longer, as if searching for something in the depths of his expression, some flicker of doubt, some hidden uncertainty. But there was none. At last, he inclined his head. "Then, what would you have us do?" Thranduil straightened, his voice once more cold and clear. Send scouts to the ruins of Dal Guldur. If the shadow stirs, I would see it with my own eyes before I act, and double the patrols along our borders. The world may change, Galleon, but our duty remains. So long as I am king, the woodland realm shall not be left unguarded. Galleon nodded and stepped back, his departure swift and silent, like a ghost vanishing into the dark. Thranduil remained alone, his gaze lingering upon the great carvings that lined the walls, upon the twisting patterns of gold and silver that adorned his halls, each telling a story older than many kingdoms of men. The silence stretched, and in that silence, he heard the voice of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the soft sigh of the wind as it moved through the glades, the distant echo of water upon stone. He had once believed the world immutable, that the stars above would shine unchanged for all eternity. But the stars had shifted, and so had the world beneath them, and yet he remained, like the last tree upon a barren hill, standing defiant against the tide of time. And in the south, beyond the borders of his realm, the ruins of Dal Guldur stood in silence, broken and forgotten. But beneath the ruins, beneath the crumbling stone and the twisted roots that had begun to reclaim the land, something moved, and in the depths of the long-abandoned halls, where darkness had once ruled and been cast out, a whisper stirred. It was faint, no louder than a breath upon the wind, yet it carried with it the promise of something old, something waiting. The night deepened over Urin Lascalin, the vast canopy of the woodland realm stretching like a river of ink, scattered with the pale glimmers of stars that watched the world below with cold, ancient indifference. The trees, tall and gnarled with the weight of countless years, stood in solemn witness to the hush that had settled upon the land, not a silence of peace, but one of waiting. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, fallen leaves whispering as they drifted down to the moss-covered ground, mingling with the crisp fragrance of pine. And something else, something more elusive, a presence lingering at the edge of sight, like a breath that did not belong. It was a silence that seemed to breathe, to shift, as though the land itself was holding its breath. Beneath the vaulted halls of his fortress, Thranduil sat within his private chamber, the dim glow of lanterns casting flickering shadows upon the polished wood and stone. The chamber was vast, yet sparsely adorned, a place of quiet contemplation. A great tapestry hung upon the wall, woven with the image of Greenwood the Great as it had once been, before shadow had ever touched its borders. Golden leaves unfurled in an eternal summer, the waters of the enchanted river gleaming silver beneath the moon. His gaze traced the edges of the tapestry, following the weave of golden threads, as though searching for something long since lost. He did not turn as the door behind him opened, nor did he need to. He knew the step of the one who entered. Galleon moved with careful grace, his approach measured, his silence heavy with the weight of unspoken words. There was something in the quiet of his movements, had told Thranduil all he needed to know before a single word had been spoken. "They have returned," Thranduil said at last, his voice quiet, unreadable. Gallion inclined his head, though his expression was grave. "They have, my lord." He hesitated for only a moment before continuing, his voice carefully measured, each word carrying the careful weight of one who knew they would be met with deep scrutiny. "And they bring troubling news." At last, Thranduil turned his gaze, meeting that of his attendant. Though his face betrayed little, the cool steel in his eyes sharpened. "Speak plainly, Gallion. I have no patience for riddles tonight." Gallion inclined his head slightly, a silent acknowledgement of the burden his king carried. Then he spoke. "The ruins of Dol Guldur are not as empty as we believed. The stones crumble, the halls lie in ruin, but something stirs beneath them. The air there is thick, heavy with a presence unseen, as though the very land itself remembers the dark hand that once ruled it. The trees that grow upon its borders bear no leaves, their roots curling like grasping fingers into the soil. And the wind," he hesitated, as though the very memory of it unsettled him. "The wind carries voices, my lord, whispers that have no source, no tongue, yet they linger, like the breath of something that should not be." Thranduil's expression remained unreadable, though his fingers curled slightly against the arm of his chair, a gesture so small it might have gone unnoticed by any but those who had known him for centuries. "Did they see anything?" Gallion shook his head, though his unease was evident in the way his hands clasped behind his back, knuckles paling under the pressure. "Nothing that bore form, but the scout who ventured closest to the ruins spoke of a presence. He described it as a shadow without substance, a weight upon his chest that pressed deeper the longer he lingered. He said it was as though something was watching him, though when he turned, there was nothing. The chamber seemed colder suddenly, though no wind stirred its depths." Thranduil sat in heavy silence, his mind tracing old paths, old wounds. Dol Guldur had been the necromancer's lair, a festering wound upon the land where darkness had taken root and spread like a poison into the bones of the forest. The White Council had driven its master forth, had broken its walls, had left it to ruin. But ruin did not always mean death, and darkness, true darkness, was not so easily vanquished. For a long moment, he did not speak, and when he did, his voice was quieter, colder. "You remember the first days of the shadow, Gallion." It was not a question. Gallion's gaze was steady. "I do. When greenwood began to darken, when the air thickened with an evil none could yet name." Thranduil did not wait for an answer. He knew Gallion remembered, as all who had dwelt in these halls did. It had been subtle at first, no more than a whisper in the leaves, a hush upon the streams, as if the forest itself feared to wake something that had long slumbered. And then the sickness came. The trees grew twisted, their roots blackened as though burned from within. The creatures of the forest became restless, their eyes wild, their cries unnatural. And then His fingers tightened imperceptibly. Then the fear took root, a fear without name, without form, yet present in every shadow, in every space just beyond the light. Gallion was silent, but his gaze did not waver. "You believe it has returned." Thranduil exhaled, slow and measured, as though tasting the thought before speaking it aloud. "I believe that evil is not so easily banished from the world." His voice was quiet, unshaken. "It changes. It waits. It bides its time in the places forgotten by those who wish to forget." His gaze darkened. Dal Guldur may have fallen, but something stirs within its bones, and if we do not act, we may find that it has already taken root while we turned our gaze elsewhere. Gallion shifted slightly, as though weighing his next words. "Then what must be done, my lord?" Thranduil turned back to the tapestry, his gaze once more tracing the golden leaves that no longer grew beyond these halls. His voice was low and measured. "I will go." Gallion's brow furrowed slightly, though he did not seem surprised. "You mean to lead the scouting party yourself?" Thranduil turned to him, his expression unwavering. "If the land remembers what once dwelt there, then I would see it with my own eyes. I have walked this realm longer than most who remain. If darkness lingers, I will know it." He stood, his movements slow yet purposeful, and the torches upon the walls cast long shadows as he straightened. A king, not yet ready to bow before the weight of time. "Gather those who will ride with me. We leave at dawn." Gallion hesitated only a moment before inclining his head in silent obedience. "It will be done." He turned, striding toward the door. But before he reached it, he paused. "My lord," he said quietly, not turning back. "Do you fear what you will find there?" Thranduil was silent for a long moment, his gaze drifting beyond the chamber, beyond the halls, beyond the walls that had shielded his realm for so long. When he spoke at last, his voice was quiet, distant, almost wistful. "I do not fear the darkness, Gallion." He exhaled, the weight of ages settling upon his shoulders. "I fear what remains of me if I find nothing at all." Gallion said nothing more, only bowed his head and disappeared beyond the doors, leaving Thranduil alone with his thoughts and the quiet whisper of the forest beyond. The dawn that followed was pale and cold, whispering of distant winters, even as the last traces of autumn clung stubbornly to the golden branches. The great forest of Lascalon stretched endlessly, its towering trees standing like silent sentinels over the land. Mist gathered thick that morning, weaving through the trunks like a spectral shroud, dulling the hues of lingering leaves. The hush of early morning lay heavy upon the earth, as though the world itself had drawn a breath and held it waiting. Thranduil stood at the threshold of the forest, his long robe of midnight blue embroidered with silver threads that curled like vines against the fine fabric. His pale hair, unbound, flowed freely over his shoulders, gleaming like captured starlight. The circlet upon his brow, slender silver branches forming a crown, both regal and subdued, rested against his skin with with a familiar weight, not worn for vanity, but because it had become a part of him, as much as the land he ruled. Behind him, his warriors stood ready, few in number, but chosen with care. They were his most trusted, for this was not a march to war, but an errand of knowledge, and wisdom was best gathered in silence, not in strength. Their steeds, fair and swift, shifted slightly in the crisp morning air, their breath rising in faint clouds. Each elf bore a quiet solemnity upon his face, an instinctive awareness that this journey was not merely one of distance, but of purpose. To ride toward Dal Guldur was to ride toward the ghosts of the past. And ghosts did not always remain bound to memory. Gallion stood at Thranduil's side, his usual composure tempered now by something else, something quieter. He was a practical elf, bound more to duty than sentiment, yet there was hesitation in his gaze as he regarded his king. "My lord," he said at last, breaking the silence, "there is still time to reconsider. This road leads not only to shadowed lands, but to the past. And the past has a way of demanding its due." Thranduil turned his gaze toward him, and for a moment, the weight of centuries lay stark upon his features. "The past is never silent, Gallion," he said, his voice measured, his words carrying the gravity of long years. "It lingers in the stones, in the trees, in the very air we breathe. You speak as though it is a place one may turn away from, as though it is a door that may be closed. But it is not." His gaze drifted toward the mist-draped path before them, the road winding southward into the unseen. It follows, it waits, and sometimes it rises when least expected. Gallion studied him for a long moment before exhaling softly. "Then you go to meet it." Thranduil's eyes darkened. "I go to see what remains." His voice was quiet, yet there was something in it that could not be ignored. "The world is changing, Gallion. The Eldar depart, and Middle-earth shifts beneath our feet. And yet, there are things that do not change. Shadows that linger, echoes that refuse to fade." He paused, his gaze cold as the breath of winter. "I would know if this is one of them." Gallion was silent before inclining his head in understanding. "Then may the stars watch over you, my lord." Thranduil turned away, stepping toward his steed with the ease of one who had spent lifetimes in the saddle. The great silver-gray horse shifted beneath him, intelligent eyes watching the mist ahead as he swung himself into the saddle. The others followed suit, their movements fluid and wordless. There was nothing more to say. The path had been chosen. The ride through the forest was quiet, save for the soft rhythm of hooves upon the leaf-strewn earth. The mist clung to them, swirling in their wake like the remnants of forgotten dreams. The trees here were old, their trunks bearing the scars of time, their roots thick and gnarled, twisting through the soil like veins of some slumbering giant. The light filtering through the high boughs was pale and uncertain, shifting in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as though the forest itself was watching. For a time, there was only the journey, the steady breath of the horses, the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth, the distant call of a bird that seemed strangely out of place in the hush. But as they rode deeper, the silence began to change. It was subtle at first, no more than a shift in the air, a tension that could be felt rather than heard. The forest, which had always been alive with sound, the sighing of the wind, the whisper of leaves, the murmuring of distant streams, had begun to still. It was not the peace of an untouched glade. It was the hush of something waiting. Thranduil slowed his steed, lifting a hand. His company followed suit, drawing to a halt. The mist had thickened here, rolling between the trees like a living thing, veiling the land ahead in a shroud of uncertainty. He did not speak, but he did not need to. The others felt it too, the weight in the air, the way the very ground seemed to hold its breath. One of the warriors, a tall elf with keen eyes and hair dark as the depths of the forest, shifted in his saddle. "My lord," he murmured, his voice low, cautious. "Something is wrong." Thranduil did not answer immediately. Instead, he closed his eyes, reaching out not with sight, not with sound, but with something deeper. Something that had always been a part of him, as it was a part of all elves. He listened, not to what was there, but to what was missing. And then he understood. The wind had stopped, not merely slowed, not merely changed direction. It had ceased entirely. The trees did not stir. The leaves did not shift. The mist did not part. The air was utterly, completely still. A stillness that was unnatural. A stillness that did not belong. Thranduil opened his eyes. "We do not ride forward blindly," he said, his voice low but firm. "We dismount. We move carefully." Without question, the others obeyed, slipping from their saddles in near silence. Even the horses sensed the change, their ears flicking, their breaths heavier, though they made no sound. The warriors moved like shadows, spreading out, their hands resting lightly upon their blades, though no weapon had yet been drawn. And then, just at the edge of sight, beyond the thickening mist, there was movement, a flicker, there then gone. Not a shape, not a form, but a shift in the air itself, like the space between one heartbeat and the next. Thranduil's fingers brushed the hilt of his blade. The past, it seemed, had not remained behind. It had come to meet him. The mist thickened into an impenetrable shroud, weaving through the ancient trees like pale fingers seeking purchase in the dark. The towering trunks, gnarled with age, loomed like silent sentinels, their bark slick with lingering dampness. The stillness pressed upon them, heavy and unnatural, wrapping around them like unseen chains. Even the very air felt weighted, thick with something just beyond the edge of comprehension. Something waiting. Thranduil moved forward with measured grace, his steps deliberate and soundless against the leaf-strewn earth. His warriors fanned out behind him, their movements precise, their hands resting upon the hilts of their blades, though no weapon had yet been drawn. They did not need to speak. They understood the nature of this place. The ruins of Dal Guldur had long been abandoned, or so it was said. But abandoned places were never truly empty. Memory lingered in stone, in the shattered walls that still reached toward the sky like the skeletal remains of some long-dead beast. The wind that once howled through the broken fortress was absent, but the silence was worse. It was as if the very land had been hollowed out, stripped of all life, leaving behind only echoes of something unseen, a flicker of movement just at the edge of sight. It was not solid, not a shape that could be clearly seen, but rather the absence of one. A disruption in the mist, a shadow cast without form. Thranduil's fingers tightened around the hilt of his sword, but he did not draw it. Not yet. He had lived too long to mistake the unknown for immediate danger. Though instinct, ancient as the stars, whispered caution in the marrow of his bones. One of the elves, a warrior named Lon, exhaled slowly. "This place remembers," he murmured, his voice barely more than a breath against the hush. "Even after all these years, it holds the weight of what once was." Thranduil did not glance at him, though he did not disagree. "Some wounds do not heal, even when the blade that inflicted them is gone," he said, his voice low and thoughtful. "They scar over, grow quieter with time, but beneath the surface, the ache remains. Dal Guldur had not merely been a fortress. It had been an infestation, a sickness upon the land itself. Evil did not simply vanish. It lingered, like a scent upon the wind, waiting for the moment when it might take root once more. Lon hesitated before speaking again, his tone cautious. "Do you believe it has already begun?" Thranduil exhaled, his breath visible in the cool air. "I believe that the past is not content to remain where we left it." They pressed forward, the mist curling around them like something alive, thickening the closer they came to the ruins. The ground beneath their feet shifted, the soft earth giving way to stone cracked and worn with age. Shapes began to emerge from the haze, broken pillars, half-buried foundations, the remnants of archways now collapsed into forgotten rubble. Dal Guldur had never been a place of beauty. Even in its height, it had stood in stark contrast to the fair cities of the Eldar, where their halls had been filled with light and flowing architecture. Dal Guldur had been a fortress of shadow, of iron and silence, built not to shelter, but to command. And yet, for all its ruin, the air here was not dead. Something stirred beneath the surface, something unseen, but not unfelt. A weight pressed upon them from all directions, not overwhelming, but steady, watching. A scout who had gone ahead reappeared from the mist, his expression troubled. "My lord," he said, dipping his head respectfully. "There is something you must see." Thranduil nodded once, following. His warriors fell into step beside him, their forms shifting in and out of the mist like wraiths. The ground sloped downward, revealing a clearing where once a great courtyard had stood. The remains of an archway still lingered, its its edges crumbled, yet its purpose unmistakable. But it was not the ruins themselves that had drawn the scouts' concern. In the center of the courtyard lay a formation that had not been there before. At first glance, it seemed nothing more than a scattering of broken stones, half buried in the earth. But as Thranduil stepped closer, his sharp eyes traced the lines with growing unease. This was no random scattering. The stones had been arranged, not by time, not by nature, by purpose. Lon knelt, brushing his fingers lightly over one of the slabs. His expression darkened. "These marks," he murmured, his voice tight. "They are not old." Thranduil's gaze darkened as he studied the symbols carved into the stone. Lines intersecting in deliberate patterns. Ancient runes that did not belong to elves, nor to men, nor even to dwarves. They were older than the written tongues of the free peoples, older than even the first days of the Second Age. They were symbols of something deeper, something buried beneath history, something waiting to rise again. "This is not the work of time," Thranduil said at last, his voice quiet but edged with steel. "Someone, something has been here." Galleon, who had remained silent until now, took a step closer. His usual composure was strained. "What do these marks mean, my lord?" Thranduil did not answer immediately. Instead, he closed his eyes, listening beyond sight, beyond sound. He had walked these lands for an age. He had felt the presence of darkness before, had known its weight in the very air, in the way the trees ceased their whispering when it passed. And here, in this place, where ruin should have been final, he felt it again, a presence, not strong, not yet whole, but growing, like the first tendrils of rot, seeping into a once healthy tree. At last, he opened his eyes. "It is a calling," he said, his voice steady but grave. "A summoning of something that should remain buried." Galleon's gaze flickered over the ruins, his expression unreadable. "Do you believe the darkness has already returned?" Thranduil studied the symbols once more, then turned his gaze to the mist beyond, where the land fell away into deeper shadow. "I believe," he said slowly, "that we stand at the edge of something not yet awoken." His voice, though calm, held the weight of certainty. "But if we do not act," he turned toward his warriors, his cloak shifting in the cold air, "it will wake." The mist swirled around them, shifting like breath in the cold. Somewhere in the distance, beyond the reach of their sight, something moved, not seen, not heard, but present, watching, waiting. The mist clung to the ruins, curling around the broken stones like the breath of something unseen. The eerie stillness thickened, stretching into an unnatural hush, as though the very air had been hollowed out. Even the faintest sounds, the shifting of boots on stone, the quiet breath of the elves, felt swallowed by the silence. It was not the quiet of peace, but of something lying in wait. Thranduil stood at the edge of the ancient courtyard, his gaze fixed upon the arcane symbols carved into the stones. The markings were precise, untouched by time's erosion. Whoever had etched them had done so recently, and with purpose. He could feel the weight of them in the air, an unspoken language woven into the land itself. The runes pulsed with the echo of something old, something that did not belong in the waking world. Galleon stepped forward, his expression dark with contemplation. "My lord, I do not know these markings. They are not of Elven script, nor do they bear resemblance to the black speech of Mordor." He hesitated. "There is something unnatural about them. They feel wrong." Thranduil traced his fingers over one of the stones without touching it, feeling the presence that lurked beneath its surface. "There are words older than any tongue spoken in Middle-earth today," he murmured. "Languages that were not meant to be known, only buried. Some knowledge is a poison, one that seeps into the mind, corrupts the will. There were those who once sought power through such words, who thought to bend the unseen forces of the world to their desire." His voice hardened, but those who spoke them seldom lived to see what they had awakened. The elves stood motionless, their hands resting upon their weapons, though none yet dared to draw steel. The ruins had long been silent, but there was a presence here. It did not call out, did not reveal itself in shape or form, but it watched. Lon knelt, his fingers brushing against the smooth grooves of the runes. His breath was slow, measured. "This is not the work of mere scavengers or lost wanderers," he said. "Whoever did this, they knew what they were calling." He glanced toward Thranduil. "Do you believe they succeeded?" Thranduil did not answer immediately. He had walked the halls of many ruins, had seen the remnants of dark sorcery long since forgotten. Power did not die with its master, nor did it simply dissipate into nothingness. It lingered. It waited. "No," he said at last, his voice quiet yet edged with certainty. "Not yet." Galleon turned toward him, his brow furrowed. "Then whatever is being summoned has not fully risen." Thranduil's gaze drifted beyond the ruins, toward the mist-choked forest that surrounded them. "Not yet," he repeated, "but it will." A silence stretched between them, thick with understanding. This was not a relic of the past, nor a remnant of an old war. This was something stirring now, something waking. One of the scouts who had ventured ahead reappeared from the mist, his expression tense. "My lord," he called, dipping his head in respect. "There is something you must see." Thranduil nodded once, following the scout. The others fell into step behind him. The air grew colder as they moved deeper into the ruins, descending toward what had once been the great inner halls of Dol Guldur. The path was strewn with shattered stone and broken pillars, remnants of the fortress that had once stood defiant against the passage of time. The archways had crumbled, their jagged remains stretching skyward like the ribs of a great beast long since fallen. But it was not the ruins themselves that halted their steps. It was the object resting upon the raised platform at the very center of the ruined hall. A book bound in blackened leather, its edges charred, as if it had been plucked from fire. It was neither large nor ornate, yet it exuded something, an almost tangible force that seemed to pulse against the air around it. The very presence of it unsettled the elves, an instinctual warning stirring in the depths of their minds. Thranduil approached it slowly, his steps soundless upon the stone. He did not reach for it, not yet. Galleon's voice was cautious. "My lord, do not touch it." Thranduil did not turn his gaze from the book. "Do you think I do not know what lies within such things, Galleon?" His voice was soft, almost distant. "Knowledge is like a blade. It may cut through the darkness, but it may also wound the hand that wields it." His expression darkened. "And some wounds do not heal." Lon shifted uneasily. "We should not linger here. If this is what they sought, then we must assume they will return for it." Thranduil exhaled, his eyes narrowing slightly. "No," he murmured. "Whoever came here did not leave of their own will." He gestured toward the ruined hall. "There are no footprints, no signs of a hurried departure." His voice was colder now, quieter. "They did not leave." The words settled upon them like frost. The ruins did not merely feel abandoned. They felt hungry. Something had come before them. Something had taken what it wished, and it had left no trace of those who had dared to call it forth. Thranduil's fingers brushed against the surface of the book, but still he did not lift it. He could feel it, even without opening its pages. It did not simply hold words. It held something else, something waiting to be found. "We take it," he said at last, his voice steady, decisive. "If it is left here, others will find it." His gaze flickered toward Galleon. "And they will not have the wisdom to fear it as they should." Galleon hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "As you will, my lord." Thranduil reached forward. The moment his fingers met the charred leather, the air shifted, not with sound, not with movement, but with something deeper, something colder. The mist thickened, the silence deepened, and in the darkness of the ruins, unseen and formless, something watched. The past had been disturbed, and it would not remain quiet. The instant Thranduil's fingers brushed against the book's blackened leather, the air shifted, not with wind, not with sound, but with something deeper, something unseen pressing against the world like the weight of an unseen tide. The mist thickened around them, curling like grasping fingers through the shattered remains of Dal Guldur. The hush, already unnatural, deepened into something heavier. It was not silence. It was absence, as if the land itself had drawn a breath and had never exhaled. The elves did not move. They stood in perfect stillness, their instincts honed over centuries, warning them that something had changed. The ruins, empty only moments before, now carried a presence. Not yet seen, not yet named, but felt. Thranduil tightened his grip around the book. It was heavier than it should have been, not in weight, but in presence, as if it carried more than ink upon its pages. His mind reached toward it, listening not with ears, but with something deeper, something ancient. He did not yet open it. There would be time for that. But whatever lay within had not been forgotten by the place it had been left. Lon, his voice low, edged with wariness, broke the silence. "My lord, this place feels," he exhaled slowly. "Wrong." Thranduil's eyes remained fixed upon the book. "Wrap it in cloth," he commanded. "Do not let your skin touch it." Without hesitation, Lon obeyed, pulling a length of fine elven cloth from his satchel and wrapping it carefully around the book before lifting it into his arms. Even beneath layers of fabric, the air around it felt heavy. Gallion scanned the ruins, his sharp gaze wary. "We should leave," he murmured. "I do not like the way the mist moves." Neither did Thranduil. He turned toward his warriors, their hands still resting upon their hilts, their gazes flickering between the shifting mist and the empty halls that seemed suddenly less empty. He had felt this presence before long ago, in the days when greenwood had begun to darken, when the trees had grown twisted, when the land itself had recoiled from the shadow that had crept into its bones. This was not merely a lingering evil. This was something waiting, watching. "We return to the woodland realm," Thranduil commanded, his voice low but firm. "Stay close. Do not stray from the path." Without another word, they moved swift and silent as shadows. The ruins stretched behind them, receding into the mist. But Thranduil did not look back. He had spent too many lifetimes fighting darkness to be so foolish. Whatever had stirred here had not yet fully risen, but he had no doubt that it would. The descent through the forest was different than their journey in. The trees, though unchanged in form, now carried a weight upon them, their limbs unmoving, their voices silent. It was as if the land itself had been listening, waiting for something to return. And now, with the book taken, it no longer waited. It watched. Thranduil rode at the head of the company, his gaze fixed upon the distant lights of his halls, the golden glow faint through the dense trees. He had no doubt that Dol Guldir's ruin had been disturbed long before their arrival. The markings upon the stone had not been left idly, nor had the book been abandoned by accident. Someone had sought it. Someone had tried to awaken what should have remained buried. But where had they gone? Who or what had answered? By the time they reached the woodland realm, the dawn had begun to break, a pale light unfurling over the trees like a breath of relief. The golden leaves of the elven halls shimmered beneath the first touch of the sun, casting long shadows upon the stone paths that led into the fortress. The guards at the gates bowed as their king passed, but their sharp eyes flickered toward the wrapped object in Lon's arms. Even without knowing what it was, they could sense its presence. As Thranduil dismounted, Gallion stepped beside him. "You mean to keep it here?" "I mean to keep it contained." Gallion hesitated, then inclined his head. "Then we must ensure that no one seeks to claim it." Thranduil met his gaze, his expression unreadable. They already have. Without another word, he turned, striding through the corridors of his halls, the torches casting flickering light against the carved walls. The woodland realm had endured through war, through shadow, through the slow erosion of time. But even the strongest halls could not keep out the past forever. He led them deep into the heart of the fortress, where the air was still and untouched by the world above. The chamber he chose was quiet, its walls smooth stone, unmarked by time. Here, in the depths of his realm, where light did not touch and sound did not carry, the book would be placed. Watched, guarded, Lon set it down carefully upon a table of polished oak. Even through the cloth, its presence was felt, a thing not meant to be found, not meant to be carried. Galleon exhaled slowly, and now Thranduil did not answer immediately. His gaze remained upon the book, its presence filling the chamber with something unspoken. There were things in Middle-earth that were meant to be forgotten, but history had never been content to remain in the past. At last he spoke, his voice quiet, steady. Now, he said, we learn what it wishes to tell us. The book lay before him, waiting, and in the distance, beyond the halls of the woodland realm, beyond the borders of his kingdom, the ruins of Dal Guldur stood beneath the shifting mist. And though no voice was raised, though no footstep stirred within its crumbling halls, the darkness that lay within did not sleep. It watched, and it waited.